So we're just letting everybody join. We will start very shortly. Okay, Claudiana, do you want to start sharing your slides while I start the... It's going to be a very brief introduction. Thanks everybody for joining. Usual sort of broad setup. We will aim to go for about 45 minutes of talk, plus or minus a little bit either way is fine. And then if you have questions along the way, if you put them in the Q&A, then I will sort of pose them at opportune moments to Claudiana. And otherwise, at the end, we'll have a more general discussion. And the aim will be to finish at some point between UK time, 4 p.m. and 4:15. Claudiana needs no real introduction to people who work in central bank communication, particularly in Europe. She is lying to you at the moment because her slide says she works at the ECB, and that is a lie. Claudiana has just come back from a secondment to the ECB and clearly forgot to update her slides.
Yes.
So this is paper joint with Pietro, Rayen, and Adrian, who's with us as well. So now we can call it a crack team of people all from Paris. Because Claudiana is back at the Banque de France. And this is on central bank communication of uncertainty, which is clearly, I have written many papers on central bank issues and uncertainty. And the famous quote, which I hope I'm not stealing your thunder from the first slide, because it's usually my first slide, is the one from Greenspan that basically says, monetary policy is inherently uncertain and we have to sort of deal with that. So I'm going to hand over straight to you. As I said, questions in the Q&A, and I will interrupt occasionally, but otherwise we'll have a longer discussion at the end.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm a bit embarrassed, actually, that I didn't notice the ECB. But as you said, with Adrian, we are both at Banque de France. So all our views are our own views, and they do not reflect the views of Banque de France and the Euro system. Yes, so the title is on central bank communication of uncertainty. And as you rightly pointed in Greenspan, the famous quote that it's uncertainty is a pervasive situation for monetary policy. Here we are going to do central bank communications of uncertainty with a twist, and I'll explain along the way what is the twist. But to provide a bit of a context is that the central banks usually use narratives or storytelling when communicating and explaining decisions. They are explaining how the economy is evolving and what are the challenges that they are facing. And usually these narratives or storytellings are successful if they have a continuity. So when the policymakers are not coming at every meeting and they are changing the story, but the story, let's say, they confirm the previous narratives. But sometimes the narratives needs to be revised. Either there have been shocks that they hit the economy in the meantime, or there has been a misdiagnosis of the economy. And central banks can be reluctant to act rapidly to change in narratives, and they have to wait, let's say, the confidence that the narrative has changed or their uncertainty around their assessment that the narrative has changed. And this has been particularly, let's say, very visible in the last, in the last 2 years with the emerging of inflation. Here we have a quote from Lagarde in conference of ECB and its watchers last year, quoting her, when the Governing Council met last week, we weighted up these competing forces. We concluded that the challenges facing monetary policy are changing. We have become increasingly confident that the inflation dynamics of the past decade are unlikely to return. So this is an indication that their narrative that they used to have, at least up to say the end of 2021, of a low inflation is maybe changing, and here they are more confident that this is changing. Similar for Powell, at the same time, March 2022, a quote from him: as the magnitude and persistence of the increase in inflation became increasingly clear over the second half of the last year, the FOMC pivoted to progressively less accommodative monetary policy. So there is sometimes a change in the narrative, and sometimes there's policymakers are uncertain or not very confident that this change is happening, but sometimes they are more confident that this change is happening. But sometimes central bank can also decide how much of their confidence and uncertainty to communicate to the public. And the aim of our project is first to quantify how policymakers express confidence and uncertainty during their policy deliberation. And second, how does this communication relate to monetary policy decisions? So what we do is the following. First, we're going to provide measures of policymakers, what we call confirmation and surprise sentiments. We're using text, and our text is the minutes of the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the ECB. The minutes are, let's say, provide a more, let's say, detailed information of the debates when, let's say, the members, either the FOMC or Governing Council of MPC, the debates and deliberation when they are deciding monetary policy. And then, based on our reading of some of the minutes, we collected terms, which we formed dictionaries from minutes, terms that can indicate, let's say, a communication of what we call a confirmation or a surprise, where some of the keywords that we collected are as when they are, let's say, communicating confirmation, saying things go as expected, in line with our expectation, or they remain the same or continue to go in a way that they have seen previously. In a sense, this is the narrative is confirmed. On the other hand, in the surprise, let's say, dictionaries, we have words like then expected, surprise, uncertain, risk, and others. And when building measures of sentiment on confirmation and surprise, then we observe that they have similar properties across central banks. So there's not a big surprise that the language is not as different. And interestingly, there is more confirmation than surprise in this policy deliberation. But this is also good news that the world is not changing every day for our policymakers. So they are more confirming than being surprised. And this communication is also more geared towards the future. So there is a forward-looking communication with confirming that things remain or continue, or then discussing the past. We also observe that in terms of surprise to confirmation or the net surprise tend to increase during recession, not but also around monetary events that have, let's say, more uncertain outcome, when there are new policy tools, when there is either the start of buying asset purchases or the lift-off. And to give a bit more context, we also looked what are the topics that these central bankers are more surprised or that they are confirming. And inflation and economy are the main topics in these quotes. But we also have, let's say, financial conditions or international part for either BOE or the ECB. And these topics are not always contributing the same in either in surprise or confirmation. The contribution is varying over time, and we will see that this is also an important information of what is the focus or the attention of our central bankers with respect to what they are confirming and what they are surprised about. And finally, we show that these sentiment measures that we have built, they are informative of the policy stance. We find that a higher communication of surprise is associated with higher odds of an easier policy. And this result may not be surprising if we have in mind the literature of uncertainty and policy uncertainty, where uncertainty has a demand type-like effects. So higher communication of surprise is more indication of an easier policy. However, and let's say more intriguing is the case of confirmation, where we find that confirming an increase in the communication of confirming trends is rather indication of a tighter policy. And we find that it is to understand this let's say change in the sign is very important to see what is the topic of surprise and confirmation. We find that it's the inflation topic. So as central banks increase, let's say, confirming, let's say, a behavior for inflation, this is rather an indication that for a tighter policy.
Claudiana, just to because I think you're about to click onto it, but there's already questions about exactly how you measure it. So I'm sure this is one of your slides. So the question is about how you categorize phrases like a change is less than expected, so negation issues. But I'm assuming you're going to come on to that in a bit.
So I'm sorry, I lost. Did I lose my my slide because?
No, it was well. It was still showing for us.
Okay, I lost it for myself because there it asked me to update. You still see the slides?
No, now they're gone.
Okay, I'm sorry, because it asked me to update, and I said I don't want to update. But then, so okay. So in the meantime, what was the question? I tried to open it again.
I think it's essentially how do you deal with negation? So, like if they say a change is less than expected versus more than expected, so it's expected a bit, but not as much, and that's clearly some surprise.
So yeah, we deal actually to not have a problem with the negation. We are if the change, if we find this, we are going to get rid of those. We are not counting. Do you see the slides? I'm sorry.
No.
Okay. Because now I see my slides.
Do you want to try share screen again, or?
Okay, I will try. I'm very sorry for this. Just that the computer asked me to update Firefox, and it.
Do you want me to share them?
Just 1 second, unless it asks me to. So with regard to negation, yes. So we are going to look to our keywords. So we find quotes, and if we are finding a negation, actually we are going to get rid of those quotes, to not have this problem how to in which bin to put. I'm very sorry. I'm trying to open. Okay, so let me try again. And then if this doesn't work, then please just help me with. Okay.
Seem to be coming. They're coming. They're here.
Okay. So I'll discuss in detail then how we deal with this. But we take into account the negations, and we went for probably the easiest way, but also we lose information by just dropping the quotes that have negations. How do we relate to the literature? Obviously, we relate with the big literature of the role and informational content of sound and communication. And here we are, let's say, putting on the spotlights the minutes as text, and that is informative for monetary policy decisions, but also more closely relating to the role and the quantification of policy uncertainty with let's say the famous examples of Baker Bloom and Davis measures of policy uncertainty. However, we are dealing here with the uncertainty, on the uncertainty part, with the uncertainty of the policymakers, and this makes us complementary to your work with Anna Sislak and others. We are studying the Fed's uncertainty expressed in FOMC transcripts. And what we are highlighting is we are highlighting both the uncertainty, which we are calling the surprise part, but also the confirmation part in these three central banks, and showing that they are also providing a different signal to monetary policy. Let's go through the minutes and how we construct these measures. So we are looking at the minutes for the Fed, BOE, and these minutes for the ECB are called actually monetary policy accounts, but we are going to use the word minutes for the three of them. And as I said, they provide a detailed summary of the discussions in the policy meeting. They are similar in concepts because the meetings that they are reporting are similar in concept and in goal. However, they have some differences in content, and the most important difference is actually the publication of dissents or not, and when they are published. For the Fed and the ECB, these minutes, they contain let's say the discussions, or let's say a summary of staff or members' presentations. And the second part of usually this meeting is the members' deliberation. This is the part where after presentations, now members are discussing how they see the economy going and what they would like to decide for monetary policy. For the case of BOE, these minutes, they represent only the monetary policy committee members' views. So we don't have the staff presentation in these minutes. One may say why these minutes are interesting. The decision is already known. Actually, the interest for the minute is this detailed summary of the discussions, to see the diversity of views, to see where is the focus of the committee. And for this reason, they are very closely watched also by media and market participants, even if there is not news in terms of policy actions, because policy actions has already been taken and it's public. So here's some quotes from media. When minutes are published, usually they are published with delay for ECB and the Fed, and currently the BOE has they publish immediately the minutes as with the statements. So here, S&P closed higher after Fed minutes confirm inflation focus. So this is what the Fed watchers are looking usually in these minutes. Or here, the second one, uncertainty prevails over future course of interest rates. And with regard to ECB compromised on smaller rate hike with promise to do more, accounts show. So this is just to say that these minutes are seen as important to provide information about monetary policy, maybe future, the path, but also where is the members, let's say, focus, or what is the diversity in views. Some statistics we have for Fed, BOE, and ECB. The meetings, the minutes, they follow let's say the frequency of the meetings, which is 8, 12, and 8 for each of these central banks. As I said, they differ on their publication lags. BOE, since 2015, they immediately publish the minutes, and the publication lag currently for Fed and ECB is 3 and 4 weeks after the decision. And as I said, the one important information is the dissents, and ECB currently doesn't publish the dissents, while Fed and BOE they do. We have data from 93 for the Fed, 98 for BOE, and ECB started much later publishing the account. As I said, minutes are divided we divide them in two main parts, which follow the let's say the meetings, where first the staff or the members of the executive board provide an overview of economic and financial conditions, or what we call presentations. And then the second part is the policymakers' view on economic developments and policy decision, what we call the deliberation part. And our focus of building our measures is on the deliberation part of the meetings. And here you can see, let's say, in terms of the number of words, how much the deliberation part takes in these minutes. And you can see that overall, the number of there is a trend of more words after the financial crisis, and this seems to relate also with times when there are more, let's say, either difficult decisions or new decisions that have not been taken before. So if we concentrate on, let's say, on the times of unconventional monetary policy, and now after COVID and increase of inflation, but also there is some maybe suggestive evidence that the how much time is spent on deliberating policy may depend also on who's the chair. The last years of Greenspan were, let's say, very fast. Very few words were needed to decide on monetary policy, and then with Bernanke and Yellen, so the number of words that is expressed in these meetings is higher. This can be also an indication of how much the diversity now, let's say, there maybe these central banks have become more transparent on the diversity of views, so they probably reflect also an increase in the diversity of views within the committee when deciding monetary policy. Similarly, for the BOE under King, there is let's say less words or less time is used on the deliberation part of policy, and this had increased with Carney and especially with Bailey. So there might be also let's say a chair influence on how much time is used for deliberation in monetary policy. To build our dictionaries first and then measures of confirmation and surprise, we proceed as follows. First, we are going to we read ourselves some minutes from the Fed, BOE, and ECB to understand the language. So to understand what an expert would let's say this is an uncertainty case or a surprise case or a confirmation case. So we read, collected, and classified quotes in minutes as confirmation or surprise. Then from these quotes, we identified those keywords that might indicate, then we can use in our let's say machine learning techniques to do the counting for the whole let's say corpus of minutes. And we name these as expert curated dictionary. Then we expand this dictionary using synonyms or conditionals, and we call this like machine learning enhanced dictionary. Since some of the keywords is not just one keywords but expressions, then we use pattern analysis and negations to deal with if we have then expected or not as expected. So, and the question that we had before, how do we deal with negations? So we have a list of negations, and if we are going to find a negation around our keywords, actually we are, at the moment, we are just dropping those quotes. And finally, then we are going to count this confirmation.
So can I just,
yes.
Yes. I mean, I think you know this because you answered it in response to Petra's question earlier.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a sense in, I mean, you're right. There's two dimensions to the ways you can treat this. One is neutralize it. So because it's you know it's not as expected, you're going to just say it doesn't count. But you know, if I say something is less than expected, I'm really indicating surprise.
So if it is then,
sorry. Yeah.
The word then, it will be as a surprise. So everything that is then expected, if it's less or high, or this would enter in the surprise category.
Okay. Sorry, I just saw Athanasios has also asked the question. Following up, than expected could suggest surprise or confirmation depending on qualifiers. For example, a bit more less than expected is confirmation. Forecast errors are the norm. Surprise should only denote. Okay, so I guess that would be the a more conservative treatment of surprise.
Exactly. So we are just everything that has then expected and not the negation. It's going to be on the surprise side.
Sorry, I'm sorry for hammering this point, but it's come up with lots of questions. So So then a bit more than expected is a surprise because it's got than expected.
Yes. So let's say probably we cannot be as let's say precise with that, but this is a bit our idea that if it is then expected, this is going to be under surprise. We are not maybe saying that these are huge surprises. They are beginning to be shocked for us, but it goes more, let's say, on the surprise part and more on the indication that maybe if this continues of a change in narrative. So here are the keywords that we have. So when we started to read these quotes, we noticed that a part of them, they are confirming past expectations, as expected, in line with, unchanged, or little changed, changed little, consistent with. And the other part, they are confirming an ongoing trend. Things remain the same, they continue. So it's an ongoing situation that they are aware of. And then what we put under the surprise or uncertainty case is when things are then expected, then anticipated, then thought, than at the previous meeting, or less likely, in contrast, surprise, revised, shock, uncertain, and risk. So these are our, let's say, our dictionaries that we built from reading these quotes. And here are some just some examples from 2020, the first meeting for ECB and the Fed. In discussing recent inflation developments, members were encouraged by the fact that headline and underlying inflation had recently evolved in line with December staff projections. So is something they confirmed that things are going as they have expected. So no change, let's say, in their narrative. And the Fed, the same participant acknowledged the staff report, suggesting that the overall financial vulnerabilities remained moderate and that the financial system remained resilient. And the last one, which I cannot read because I have the thing from Zoom, but the last one refers to a new risk that has emerged as a new risk to the global growth outlook, which participants agreed warranted close watching. So this is one meeting before, let's say, the COVID, then the closure from COVID happened.
So I guess to summarize some of the reaction, it would be you might want to think carefully about how often you get these a bit more, bit less than expected as potentially being more like confirmation. So you may not say exactly in line because it's, you expected 2 and it came at 1.8. But it's only a bit less, and you're really trying to signal that it's close to what you wanted.
Okay, so these might be overall indications that we might be more conservative. So let's say we might be putting more on the surprise than might be.
So a more conservative approach would be to think about those
as refinements.
And since I'm interrupting and I want to shut up in a second, Jill Vardy has just asked about the forward-looking, and I know you do have forward-looking elements to this, so I'm going to let you answer that, and then I'll come back to Jill's question if it's still there.
Yes. So the forward-looking actually for us is the part of the confirmation of the ongoing trend, and let's see then if you think that we are conservative on the confirmation, that there might be more confirmation than we put. Actually, the biggest part of as I said, when we put now the discounting on the whole of minutes, the blue part is the confirmation, and the yellow, let's say, shadows are on the surprise. And you can see that overall there is more blue than yellow, which means that let's say here is the case of the FOMC, but it's the similar picture for the ECB and the BOE, that there is more confirmation when discussing the economy and deliberation policy than being surprised. Then if it is about the forward looking, so there is more discussion of the look at the lightest versions of blue and yellow, that there's more about the surprise and risk than being the part that they are surprised about the past, and also more about discussion about things continue, things remain, what we call a confirmation of a trend. And as I said, this is the similar picture for the ECB and the BOE, that the confirmation takes the biggest part than the surprise. Then we look what we call a net surprise sentiment, which is the difference now of the total surprise with the total confirmation. And because we saw that the blue is bigger than the yellows, this net surprise is usually on the negative side. But we also saw that there is a variation over time of this net surprise sentiment, and this sentiment tends to increase around recessions, but also around, let's say, monetary policy events that are either new or there's more uncertainty and around them. So, of course, we have an increase of these measures around the global financial crisis, but then we have an increase for the Fed when they are deciding the third round of QE, or when they are deciding the lift-off. Of course, we have this increase for the BOE when we have the Brexit referendum, and more recently, these measures of net surprise have risen with the invasion of Ukraine and the increase in inflation. What we notice also that for the three central banks, there is quite a alignment of these net surprise sentiments, and also that there is kind of a regime shift in this net surprise before the crisis, the financial crisis, and after. And the question is why is this a strategic communication, or actually it reflects the fact that after the financial crisis there is a lot of, let's say, confirmation of trends. Let's say uncertainties and risk might be there, but these are not new, so these are known. So in a sense, the narrative here is not changing much until the COVID and the rise in inflation, where the narrative now is changing. So the net surprise is supposed to reflect really the emerging, the times when there is this emerging of risks and surprises.
So Claudiana, I'm gonna push one more thing on Jill's question. Which is so in the stuff I did with Rob Goodhead, and because I know he's in the audience, and Connor and David, when we looked at forward backward lookingness, one thing that was really useful for this was to look at the two sections of the Green Book. So if you wanted to really address Jill's question, looking at the Green Book section that just talks about recent data would be a good way to test whether you're getting, confirmations or surprises in the back data well with your approach. And then looking at the forecast part, you're more likely to pick up the kind of new emergent uncertainties and risks. And the reason, and I'm saying that publicly because I also think that for anybody doing this work, it's one of the most beautifully labeled data sets we have, because it's so firmly split. It's not perfect because there's an overview section with the forecast, and they talk about back data with the forecast, but there is some cleaner than you can usually get. That's one thing. The other thing is, I guess, a more critical comment about why it looks like they've become so much more confirming in their post financial crisis behavior could be because they have, they've become reluctant to talk about more uncertainties. You take a bit of a hit after the financial crisis. People think, oh, those guys can't forecast anything, they get everything wrong. So the only things you talk about after that are the things that you got right, because you're rebuilding trust. That's a particularly skeptical view that as an academic I'm allowed to, and I don't expect central bankers to necessarily agree. But it would be, I guess, interesting to understand that shift a little bit more. Let me pose it for those who've never seen it. or if anyone has not seen it and wants to see it, they can email me and I can send it to them. If you plot the time series of the Bank of England's forecast variance term, basically it was bouncing around but very small, and then the crisis came and they made it really wide, and then famously under Mark Carney they never changed it, so it just became this big wide band, so everything was as forecast in some sense. So there could be an element of that in their language as well. Anyway, I'm being particularly skeptical, so I'll let you carry on.
Yes, that could be one element. The other element is also that we are taking taking this language of that is a confirmation, and now we're going to see actually what are they confirming, and that might also help. A big part of monetary policy in this period is on zero lower bound, forward guidance. In a sense, they are confirming policy remaining or rates remaining low, and so in a sense, there was a lot of inaction, at least with respect to interest rate, which adds on this confirmation language. So to give a bit of more context of these measures of surprise and confirmation, we look at what are the topics of in confirmation surprise quotes for each central bank. So we looked at top 50 words. And then we grouped them because many of the words relate with inflation, prices, wages, let's say, inflation expectations, different ways of speaking about inflation, the same for economy and so. And we find that obviously, because it relates with their main objectives, economy and inflation is the topic that takes more weight on these quotes, and both in economy, both in surprise and confirmation. So this is the average number of words that, let's say, the FOMC has used for the sample that we are investigating. Let's say 10 on average, 10 words on these quotes are about economy, and a bit more are about inflation. There is some, let's say, the similarity is on the topic of economy inflation for all central banks. If you notice that the language of the ECB, we are starting from 2015 with the ECB, that there is a lot of confirmation of their monetary policy, which is, let's say, they go to these meetings and we confirm again either interest rates to remain low for a certain period, or so a lot of confirmation about their monetary policy. And there is some labor for the Fed and some international topic also for BOE and the ECB. But then we look at how these topics, especially the main topics, they behave over time, which might also indicate why that we have this, what we might call a regime shift in this net surprise that we discussed before. So what we are showing here this is for the Fed. On the left is the net surprise, what we called trend, which is the forward-looking part of the surprise in dark red, the CPI evolution in yellow, and what we call net surprise inflation, which is the number of keywords of the topics of inflation in surprise minus the topic inflation in confirmation. So if in the surprise quotes we have 10 times inflation, and in confirmation quotes we have 8 times mention of this inflation topic, then the net will be 2. And what we see is that on average, when inflation is above 2, these net surprise inflation also has a higher weight on the net surprise on the surprise communication. And as inflation actually on average was below 2% after the crisis, then we are more on the, let's say, on the confirmation part of confirming probably that inflation remains low. And things changed after the pandemic, and let's say the war in Ukraine. When you look at the other side, is the share or the net share of the economy on this net surprise, and you can see that sometimes the economy is taking, let's say, most of the surprises about the economy, and this is usually around recessions. But this was not, let's say, here economy was part of the surprise in the, let's say, in the after the financial crisis, but the confirmation was higher, and this relates mostly with the inflation topic. And we observe certainly this similar behavior when looking at the other central banks. And here we zoomed, especially what we find interesting on the last years, the post-pandemic situation. And what we notice is that inflation, let's say, for both the Fed and the ECB, surpassed the 2% levels much before then the policymakers started to be surprised about inflation. So there is a delayed surprise in what they start to discuss about inflation, and for us it's now that we see that it took several meetings for the ECB and the Fed to change their narrative, of inflation.
So just to add one other thing here, though, I think here one of the bits of information that you're throwing away potentially that's useful, if inflation is above target and I'm surprised by higher inflation, that's going to warrant much greater response from the policymaker potentially than if you're at 8% inflation and your target is 2%. But then inflation starts surprising on the downside, that might have a different reaction, certainly in terms of policy. So it might be useful to also have a kind of surprise directional indicator.
Yes, yeah, exactly. We have worked towards building that, but we have not used that yet. But we have looked on counting if this risk or surprise is downward or upside. Yes, exactly. But we will not show something with that, but it goes in your direction.
Okay, and you have a maximum of 15 minutes left,
Okay.
but ideally a little less than that.
Yes, we're almost there. And finally, just with respect to the measures, we compare these measures with the measures of Baker, Bloom, and Davis. As I said, those measures are uncertainty about policy as observed in public, and what we are measuring is uncertainty of policymakers. And the two can let's say, affect each other. So with the reading of minutes, for example, here it's one quote from Reuters: uncertainty was the key word. It was mentioned 23 times. This is referring to ECB accounts. And this is so this type of uncertainty can enter in the uncertainty of the public about policy. But also it can be vice versa, that the uncertainty of the public enters in the uncertainty of policymakers. So we observe that our measures and the measures of monetary policy uncertainty or economic policy uncertainty of Baker, Bloom, and Davis, they are positively correlated, but they are low. And this correlation is actually a bit higher after the financial crisis. And finally, what do they have a signal from monetary policy decisions, this confirmation and surprise? We are going to look at ordered profit models, because we would like to work with the policy stance variable, which for us takes a value of +1 if it is a tightening, 0 if there is no change, and -1 if there is an easing of policy. And we define these stance by taking into account changes in policy rates, the interest rate, but also changes in the what were before called unconventional, but not as unconventional, but taking into account the quantitative easing and balance sheet policies. So our ordered probit will have a monetary policy stance variable, which will have the typical Taylor rule specification. We are going to control for the forecast of the central bank, either the Green Book, either the MPC forecast, or the ECB Eurosystem staff macroeconomic projections for inflation and GDP. Then we are going to add our communication measures, which can be surprise or confirmation, but we're also adding a control that is either the monetary policy uncertainty or the economic policy uncertainty measures of Baker, Bloom, and Davis. One things to just to keep in mind before going to results is that we have these data sets, the forecast for different central banks in different periods. So the results, so for the Fed, we are until 2017, for BOE until 2019. So 2007-19 is the sample that we have forecast for the BOE, and ECB is 15 to 2023. BOE, one probably relates with the intervention that you had, Michael, before. During, let's say, the COVID year, BOE actually stopped producing forecasts, or at least publishing the forecast, at least for 2 quarters. So then we would have four holes, let's say 4 meetings without forecast. So we decided to stop before COVID. So these are the results for the Fed, BOE, and ECB, and we are going to put in for each the let's say if we have what we call total, trend, and path. These are either the surprise total, surprise trend, or path, or confirmation total, trend, and path. So what we want to see here, that the first, the usual result, that a higher CPI forecast or higher GDP forecast, they have this positive sign, which tend to indicate a higher likelihood of a tighter policy stance. Then if we have a higher communication of surprise, this is, you see across the all central bank, and even if we are working with different samples, it indicates this a lower likelihood of a tighter stance. When we go to confirmation, differently, we see that an increase in the communication of confirmation language, it is associated with a higher likelihood of a tighter policy. And sorry, I just wanted to say that controlling, and this is controlling for this economic policy uncertainty of Baker, Bloom, and Davis, which for the case of the Fed, they have also a negative sign, which is more the case of the usual, let's say, results for uncertainty. But then we look at, does it matter what is the topic in surprise and confirmation? And we see that it matters. For the BOE and ECB, if we have inflation topic in surprise, this is indicating let's say a more let's say looser policy from the 2 central banks. But inflation in confirmation, an increase in the intensity of inflation in confirmation communication, this is indicating a tighter, a higher likelihood of a tighter policy. And for growth topic, either in surprise or confirmation, this is going with a negative sign. And here, when accounting for the topics, then we are losing the significance of the MPU and EPU measures of Baker, Bloom, and Davis. So just because I was fast and because of the time, so on this result, what we see that a higher surprise is associated with a lower likelihood of a tighter policy. A higher confirmation is associated with a higher likelihood of a tighter policy, and the topic matters because it is the higher intensity of the inflation topic in confirmation quotes that goes with a higher likelihood of a tighter policy stance. And here I want to bring back again the 2 quotes that I said in the beginning. The idea is that the policymakers, especially when they have to take tough decision, which is usually on raising interest rates or providing a tighter policy, they want to become more confident or to confirm that what they see, this is now a change in narrative, and they are more confident on their narrative. So they have to become increasingly confident that inflation is unlikely to return, as Lagarde said, or as Powell said, that now they have they have seen the magnitude and persistence of inflation. These are increasingly clear. They have progressively progressed to a more accommodative monetary policy. So to conclude, we analyzed the minutes of the Fed, BOE, and ECB. We constructed dictionaries and measures of confirmation and surprise. And we showed that committee members will adopt one of their policy stance depending not only on the data that they see about inflation and let's say GDP, but also in their assessment whether the economy is evolving as expected or not. And we see these measures as multidimensional. They are, on one hand, they are capturing the balance of risks and the persistent. So if they are confirming, let's say, inflation risk remain, this is the persistent of the risk. And where is the central banker's attention with respect to inflation or growth? So we see our measures as capturing these elements that usually we don't include in our Taylor rules. Thank you for your attention.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to just remind everyone that you can still use the Q&A or type your questions in there. You could I would leave the screen. Oh, you've done it now. You've deleted it. So in case we need to go back, no, it's fine. It's fine. So let me ask one starting question, and then I'll come back and see if Petra has questions. But also, Adrian, I'm going to ask if you want to add anything on top. It's always awkward when you watch your co-author present because there's bits you wanted to say, but you can take a united front and say she nailed it.
She nailed it.
So I have a question. So again, going back to my last point about the direction of surprise, it is the fact that you find a higher surprise, and particularly I just because of geographic loyalties, I focused a lot on the Bank of England column. The fact that a higher inflation surprise is associated with a probabilistically looser policy.
Yes.
Interpret the ordered probe it that way. Does that just tell me that they were on average surprised in the sample period by inflation that was not as high as they would have expected? So are we sort of seeing the flatter Phillips curve type result that it? Oh, actually, I'm thinking of an economy that was growing. Maybe we're also seeing a weaker economy than we had expected. But again, I think having the direction of surprise would really help there.
Yes. So yeah, you're right. So the sample of the BOE is 2007, 2019, and actually, if I remember correctly, we have mostly easing decisions in that period. And the surprise, I think, the surprise about inflation was about the low and stubborn inflation that they saw, and it's the same similar for the ECB. So the Fed is more balanced because we are looking at a larger time sample with let's say more balanced tightenings and easing. So I would put more weights on those results. But in a sense, the BOE results are a little biased on the sample. And maybe they are indicative of the Phillips curve, as you said, the flattening.
But the forecasts are also intended to control somewhat for this effect, for this level of inflation relative to target effect.
Yes.
Petra.
Yes, I really like the presentation. It was very nicely done. And it's a very important topic. Communication of central bank uncertainty is notoriously difficult and challenging. I've one additional comment on the vocabulary that you use and the categorization. So I have some concern about the inclusion of less likely in the surprise category. Because it often happens that monetary policymakers are considering various risk scenarios. Yeah? So certain possibilities that could happen that they're concerned about. So for instance, now it would be like, the possibility of, very strong wage growth, which is likely to make inflation more persistent. So if then in the minutes it shows up that, one of the scenarios that they had been considering is now less likely. then you are categorizing it as a surprise, whereas really it means that, okay, this possible kind of like, this possibility is now less likely. So you're much more likely to be in a baseline scenario. But it could also be that it says the baseline is less likely, and then you're spot on, of course. It is a surprise. But especially since that central bankers often talk about scenarios, things like that, and the balance of risks, I think it's important to consider the phrase less likely, because if one of these potential risks is less likely, then it means that you face less uncertainty.
Yes, you're so what we had put the less likely on the category of actually the past, because what we did is that when we read the quotes, we had much more keywords that might be indicative, but then we started, let's say, to do a human auditing to really keep those keywords that were, let's say, if we had used in different contexts, the meaning would let's say stays the same. But we also show, let's say, the different, let's say, the less likely we had put it on the past, a past surprise, and we saw past, total, and trend. And we see that, let's say, the trend that doesn't have the less likely, it's what we call surprise trend, is continues to be significant. But I agree that we could a simple robustness to remove these ambiguous keywords and see if this makes a difference.
But even sorry, go Petra. Sorry.
So I'd like one additional comment. So unless you want to talk about vocabulary, Michael, then.
Oh, okay. So let me just put, because mine's a sort of exact follow on.
Okay.
I think it would be, rather than throw them away, I do think that the prevalence of anything we can do to measure the prevalence of tail risk type things in the thinking of the policymakers, those tail risks going up, going down. Again, this is, if I were to sort of give the one-line plug from the paper you kindly cited with Anna and Stephen and Song, it would be that there is a kind of part of the discussion is what's happening to those tail risks. And so if we think things on average should be fine, but there is a risk of high inflation, we might be more likely to signal that, to take a stronger stance, to potentially raise sooner, whatever. And so I do think if you can get measures of that, like rather than throw them away, just keep them and show them and use them as a sort of a separate entity that lives on its own. And so after Petra talks to you about more vocab, I'm going to go to Robert's question.
Can I just say, I mean, I think we're not talking about volatility. I mean, we're not talking about the second moment here. We're talking about the stability of the narrative relative to what they had previously articulated. So if you're saying that something has become less likely, I mean, a risk has become less likely than it was, then it's because you thought it was elevated before and you think it's less elevated now. Now, that is a surprise relative to your previous assessment of the overall economy of all its moments. So I just want to reinforce that the purpose of this paper is not to talk about risk or second moment kind of interpretation of uncertainty. It's how is the central bank's assessment changing over time, and where its stability versus its change.
But I think the point at which it becomes tricky is then mapping that into the ordered pro bit.
Sure.
So I agree on a measurement, but I guess a deeper way of saying what I'm saying is it could still be useful if you had this measure and said, look, there's two types of change of narrative. One is a tail risk narrative goes away, comes in, versus I've had to change my story of what the median, the government has put this vote in where the UK leaves the European Union. The world going forward is going to be just different, and we have to accept that, as opposed to, there's a tail risk that there's another virus variant. I mean, if I remember that period, that those risks went up and down with cases, and I'm sure I was not involved in policy at the time, but I'm sure it was difficult. I'm just saying they could be different, and mapping them into a 1 + 1 - 1 0 type decision is yeah. Anyway, I think the point's made.
So I'd like different comments. So I like the way you relate your measure to other uncertainty variables. And by the way, I fully agree with Michael's comment that building in the direction is very important for your probit analysis. So I like the fact that you relate your measure to GPU and NPU measures, uncertainty measures. It would be nice to also consider other measures. So for instance, like Bloomberg economic surprises. So is it the case that there's a positive relationship between the uncertainty that you pick up from the minutes and Bloomberg surprises, the survey surprises for macroeconomic releases? And what I'd really love to see is like, is there any relationship between the surprises that you pick up in the minutes and the financial market responses to the release of minutes? Now, of course, you cannot really do that for the Bank of England because they have this massive data dump. Everything is released at the same time, so you cannot really identify the minutes. But fortunately, in the case of the Fed and the ECB, the minutes are released separately, so we can actually identify market responses, financial market responses to the minutes. It would be really interesting to see whether your measures of prices captured in the minutes are positively related to financial market reactions.
Yes, thank you very much, Petra. So we had not thought about Bloomberg uncertainty, and this is a great suggestion. So we can put more measures to compare and really see who is driving what, the market uncertainty, policymakers uncertainty, or vice versa. And yes, it's a great also suggestion to look at and these measures of surprises, but also confirmation, because I think one what we see it from media reaction is, let's say, the central banks reading minutes, they confirm inflation focus. And this is really a strong, let's say, indication for markets, confirming the focus that is inflation in a times where maybe financial stability is also becoming a problem, a recession is becoming a problem. We believe this also it will be reflected in market responses. So yes, that's a great suggestion.
Okay, that relates to Rob Goodhead's question, so I'm going to read it out in a second, but you can also have it for posterity. I'm also going to just check. I know this is going to be cheeky, but Jill is in the audience. Jill, signal to me somehow that if you want to talk, because you gave a great talk on communicating uncertainty, and I know you've been at the coal face of trying to do it in real life for the Bank of Canada, but no obligation at all. While Jill is mulling that over, I'm going to read out Rob's question, which relates to what Petra just said. So how do the surprise measures relate to forecast errors? I think that would be a sort of really useful thing. Like, again, showing that they show more surprise when they've made forecast errors would be a good sort of endorsement of your measures. And then
so the forecast.
Yeah, so go ahead. You can ask a qualifier if you want.
Yeah, so the forecast errors, in a sense, if we are speaking at the meeting, they will not know, probably speaking about very fast forecast errors. Probably ex post. I understand that as an ex post. In a certain meeting, they will understand, let's say, only 1 year later, if they are doing, let's say, forecast about inflation in 1 year or 2 years, what is their errors.
Yeah, no, but that's true. But from a measurement point of view, if we've just made a massive forecast error on inflation, I would expect us to be talking a little bit about surprise on inflation as part of the narrative. And then Rob also mentions, correlating with Bloomberg or Citigroup measure of market surprises, which would be the other kind of angle to take. But no, it's okay. So I'm gonna.
Great. Thank you very much for the questions.
Jill, I'm gonna click a button that allows you to talk. If you don't want to talk, you don't have to. I think you will get the chance to not talk. So I'm gonna give her 5 seconds to see if she really wants to. But
thank you. I hope. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes, yeah, we
Yes.
hear you.
I have limited ability to tell if I'm on video or not. I think this is fascinating. It's you're right. As someone on the coal face, it's instructive to see how the extent to which these things are analyzed, and it kind of reminds me that, you know, when I'm deciding to substitute anticipated for expected in a monetary policy decision or something, it's being scrutinized by others besides us. I mean, the one fascinating thing I think, and I'd like to hear some commentary on, is, you know, all of this is happening during a period of particular uncertainty, but it's also happening during a period of increased openness and clarity by central banks. I mean, there's been this kind of, you know, move, and Michael, you've written about this, to increased accountability and transparency. And, you know, frankly, we've gotten a lot more comfortable about communicating our uncertainty. So it's not necessarily that we're more uncertain, we're just more willing to talk about it. And that's certainly the trend in communications that I've observed over the last 20 years. So I'd like to hear how that kind of fits in with the analysis that you're doing.
Yes, certainly. With this, all the literature of communication and transparency and the benefits of transparency communication. So these could. So I understand that. Is it that they are more uncertain, or is that they are communicating more uncertainty, or being more transparent? So I have to think how one can distinguish between the two cases. At least we are controlling for, as Adrian mentioned before, we're controlling about the state of the economy. We could also control with the measures, probably for the Fed, from the Green Book forecasts. I think the measures that Michael mentioned before. So if we can control for, let's say, staff measures of uncertainty, and then we could get, if on extra is part of communication, being just more transparent from the policymakers. But also we noticed something I didn't mention, that when we're looking at these net surprises, actually the Fed seems to be more confident. So there is less surprise communication from the Fed than the BOE or ECB, and this could be a strategic communication. It could be that they have better forecasting abilities or something else. So certainly there is something that we have to look if it is strategic or is it just transparency, or if there is true uncertainty there.
Yeah, the strategic element is interesting as well, because, and, you know, certainly having done communications during the global financial crisis and then during the pandemic, you know, we do adjust our communication. We do get a little more, you know, I've you know, probably awkwardly called it sort of wartime versus peacetime types of communication, where we really do, during periods of particular uncertainty, we try and get a little more forthright and a little more, here's what we know for sure, here's what we don't know. So we do adjust from a strategic point of view the types of communication that we're doing during periods of particular market stress as well.
Okay, so there was one. I'm gonna do a that was fantastically useful. There's one last question from Yuri, which is about the net surprise time series for labor employment of the Fed. Does it have a similar behavior to that of inflation, or most surprises come from inflation? I'm actually going to answer a little bit on your behalf because your slides aren't up, but I did look at this, and it wasn't for labor employment, and I don't know if you did that, so that's a bit I'd leave for you. But what was striking in your results was that when you split by inflation and growth, the growth stuff I think only mattered for the Fed and didn't matter for the other two central banks. Whereas the inflation ones did. But again, I think his point about looking at labor employment more directly, given the dual mandate, is a sort of a neat additional one to add.
I think that's a great suggestion. We concentrated on economy and inflation, and it's true. The labor could give us a more more precise indication. Then economy didn't matter much for BOE and ECB, probably also because of their objective is primary objectives are on price stability. And I think this is a nice way to show that what are the differences across these three central banks.
Excellent. Okay, if there's no other questions, I see none. Oh, Petra has.
I've actually one more comment. So with respect to your analysis, your pyramid analysis. So you currently now have just like, plus one, minus one, indicating like which way the direction is. But sometimes it's a descent and the vote can be quite close, suggesting there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yes.
And as a result, the signal of the +1 is not as strong, so it's much closer. It would be nice if you could somehow bring that in. So for instance, rather than just +1, -1, actually use the balance of vote. Of course, you cannot do that for the ECB, but you could for the Fed. And
okay, to bring the information from descents. Oh, that's great. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Because then you have more information about like how strong the actual signal is of the change in the policy stance. So now you simply say, okay, if it say was like, a tightening, but it could be a close vote. And that's not really integrated into your analysis. So
yeah, no, that's a great suggestion.
Then you
I can imagine
the
this
uncertainty. Yeah, then you incorporate the uncertainty that's inherent in the decision making through the dissenting votes into your analysis. That would be really neat, I thought. No,
that's great. I can imagine this to be more precise for the BOE because we know the FOMC, you will get maximum three dissents, but probably going from 2 to 3, it's one of this indication of the balance being.
And just because we never stop with just one additional comment, I'll add the second, which is something I wrote down at the very start, but I had it in my notes and I didn't look back to it. You said something at the very start about whether they're changing or not their narrative. I guess the really interesting thing is how they're changing their narrative relative to, say, markets. So if you had some version of this for markets, this is where your speed of adjustment would be super interesting. If I'll pick a random non-specific country that we can just imagine called economy land. Let's say in the last couple of years, the markets had realized inflation was not as transitory as maybe was being argued. And then randomly that central bank was still sticking to not raising rates yet. There I can imagine the difference in narrative. And as sort of relates to what Petra was just saying, this sort of sudden change in the narrative at some point is a little bit different because it's come later. It might be more of a relief, but still a big gap. And versus if they all move together, it might just be, oh, the data is telling us the world is a bit different and we have to move. It could be an interesting angle to take.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, at 16:13, you have amazingly stuck to the brief of between 4 and 4:15 with the discussion starting on time and being fruitful. I thank Claudiana for the presentation, Adrian for joining and answering some of the questions, Petra and Jill, thank you for joining in and adding to the panel, and everybody who joined, thank you. We will be back again. Keep an eye on your emails for the next event, which is actually that was the 8th of February, so in 14th of March. And then, I look forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, just keep watching all of the data that's coming out because, it's interesting and exciting. And there's lots of communication of uncertainty in there. So plenty of work for Claudiana and Adrian to get on with. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.